Okay, now they hear me. Okay, great. Okay, good morning once again. My name is Renata Rostkowska. I'm a director of the CCA Temporary Gallery in Cologne, and I'm super happy to welcome you all to this gathering. Just to explain to our virtual participants where we are. We are in Schöppingen, it's a small village close to Münster. And we are having here a 1 week long seminar towards permacultural institutions. The goal of this gathering is to rethink the art system, art institutions, by means of different types of ecological philosophies and practices. And yeah, we have very intense discussions here since Monday. Now we are super happy that we have some guests joining, for example, Michael Marder, that sits next to me, that will present a lecture today. And just maybe to tell you some other details, there is a whole sequence of online lectures, in fact. So we will continue with the lecture of Sourgrass Collective that is here with us. Then we will have a lecture by TJ Demos, and then by Maya and Ruben Folk. So these lectures are all accessible online. Yeah, so I am really glad to present our first guest to you. Michael Marder is a Iker Basque research professor of philosophy at the University of the Basque Country. And his main philosophical interests are environmental philosophy, ecological thought, phenomenology, and political theory. And I'm super happy to finally meet him, because Temporary Gallery already once invited him for a lecture on mosses, on these amazing little plants, and it was during the pandemic, so it could only be virtual. So we are super happy to have him here. And the title of his lecture is Towards Material Sustainabilities, Perspectival Meditations. He's author of many books. I have many of them at home, and I read also some of them on plants and also other topics, dump philosophy, for example, but yeah, also through vegetal being, written together with Luz Irigaray and the Chernobyl Herbarium. And you also often collaborate with artists, which is also really interesting for us, because our gathering, we are mostly related to visual arts as well. So that's, maybe we can find time to talk about it later as well, how you see these collaborations with artists in your work, what kind of a role they play. And I also encourage everyone to take a look at Michael's website, where you he is very generously sharing a lot of articles as PDFs, and there is also this great blog that I always liked to also incorporate in some of my teaching. Yeah, so yeah, thank you so much, Michael, for coming here, and I think we can start.
Yes, thank you so much for this introduction and for the invitation. Annette, thank you, Julie, also for the invitation. It's really a great pleasure to be with all of you here and to share my more recent thoughts on sustainability, a concept that is very problematic and that needs to be rethought literally from the ground up. Because we'll see in the course of the lecture that one of the big problems of sustainability discourses is precisely that they're moving in the opposite direction. They're moving top down, and they need to be rethought from the ground up. But I want to start with a small quotation from Nietzsche, from Human All Too Human, and you have it on the screen. This is what Nietzsche writes. One has still to be as close to the flowers, the grass, and the butterflies as a child, who is not so very much bigger than they are. We adults, on the other hand, have grown up high above them and have to condescend to them. I believe the grass hates us when we confess our love for it. He who wants to partake of all good things must know how to be small at times. Right? So the big question of sustainability, at least for me, is who sustains whom? The values implicit in the discourses of sustainability are broadly anthropocentric. From attempts to balance economic development and the health of ecosystems, to concerns with the provision of sufficient natural resources to future generations, humanity remains their first and last point of reference, the unquestioned beneficiary of reformed environmental practices. One may argue, of course, that sustainability, a concept that is notoriously ambiguous, is not a zero-sum game, since diverse plant and animal species can flourish together with us under the human stewardship of the planet. But rather than providing a vital point of departure for the thinking of sustainable development, such cross-species and cross-kingdoms communities of interest are merely felicitous bonuses accompanying the relatively recent realization of the limits to our otherwise unbridled mastery of nature. The existing discourses of sustainability make adjustments in, but do not abolish, the instrumental rationality for which all organic and inorganic entities on Earth represented potentially usable resources, and which was responsible for the onset of the global environmental crisis. At their best, when not proposing ways to market green products, and we've seen in recent days the superinflation of this green discourse when the European Union recognized nuclear fuel and natural gas as green sources of energy, right? So at their best, when not proposing ways to market green products, these discourses, finesse the cost-benefit analyses of the consequences arising from the exploitation of non-human species by taking into account the long-term effects of environmental degradation and the real possibility of the depletion of natural resources. On the grounds of instrumental rationality itself, these discourses are more rational, but they are hardly qualitatively different from the disastrous logic that has brought the planet to its current state. Now, despite some of these problems, sustainability may prove indispensable, indeed more so than deep ecology, for the reevaluation of environmental values. To activate its hidden potential, we would need to resort to immanent criticism, to criticize sustainability from within, as opposed to merely discarding it as a useless concept, not dismissing, but interrogating its silent presuppositions. Although discourses of sustainability are very different, heterogeneous, they without exception share the assumption that it is up to human beings to sustain, almost Atlas-like, the planet and to be its stewards. So it's humanity that is supposed to carry the weight of planetary integrity on its shoulders. There is a grain of truth in the supposition, both reflecting and reacting to the fact that the activity of Homo sapiens has had by far the most widespread and devastating effects on its habitats. But it is also a piece of delusional arrogance to suggest that life on Earth is or should be sustained by humans. To be sure, the continuation of life is only negatively dependent on us, who can either render the planet empty and uninhabitable in a matter of seconds through the use of sophisticated weapons, unfortunately a possibility that became once again very close to us with the current war Russia is waging against Ukraine, or gradually drive the planet to exhaustion. But the positive conditions of possibility for life lie elsewhere, not in the human. For instance, in the photosynthetic activity of plants that ensure viable levels of oxygen in the atmosphere. Human stewardship, inspired by the disproportionate significance which we attribute to our own role in the evolutionary and even cosmic processes, is superfluous in comparison to the indispensability of plants. And this occasions the question, who in fact sustains whom? If to sustain, from the Latin subtenere, literally to hold up, to prop up, means to hold up from below, then this word wields together a definite spatial orientation and the differential valuation of the higher and the lower. So what has been dismissed as the lowest, as the least significant, is actually the most essential in the task of propping up, of holding up, of sustaining a livable world. There is ineluctable inequality in the relation of the sustaining and the sustained, inequality that betokens the indebtedness of the latter before the former. So the ones who are sustained are indebted before the sustaining, obviously. Vegetal life, on which we depend both for nourishment and for oxygen, underpins animal and human lives and carries the weight of making them possible. We may term this potentiality of plants put in the service of other living beings material sustainability. And this is what is missing from the discourses of sustainability that I provisionally call ideal sustainability, right? When we, whatever form or shape they take, usually we are dealing with what I'm calling ideal sustainability, assigning to humans this disproportionate role of sustaining the planet. But we should focus on material sustainability through this seemingly naive question of who actually sustains whom. All the same, however, the most basic support plants provide to non-vegetal organisms is debased and devalued, deemed to be low on the scale of value as well. So the plants underlying all of these life processes found at the bottom of the pyramid of sustaining a livable environment are also devalued in terms of their value position, which is deemed insignificant. From this vantage point, material sustainability does not usually merit discussions or critical considerations. Instead, it is silently integrated into the strict teleology of the food chain, itself a reflection of the metaphysical hierarchy of beings. And conversely, the most superfluous creature, namely the human, proclaims itself to be the pinnacle of creation or evolution, as the case may be, and the raison d'être of the entire natural order. This is the case of ideal sustainability. And obviously, ideal sustainability describes not only our current discourses of sustainable development, but also the old hierarchies that were present in metaphysical ways of thinking in the West and in traditional theological, monotheistic theological theories and practices. As those for the sake of whom the rest of the world presumably exists, human beings convert their supplementarity on the face of the planet into the most essential thing imaginable. Ideal sustainability obscures material sustainability behind the smokescreen of anthropocentrism and reconstructs a pale version of materiality itself on the basis of ideality, turning everything in the world into a material reserve for human use. The nihilistic inversion of value differentiation is complete, and so the highest becomes the lowest, and the lowest turns into the highest. So it is not by chance that I started with Nietzsche, who recommended that the closure of the Western metaphysical project, a transvaluation of all values, which means we should take the old metaphysical hierarchies and transvalue them, invert them, and see that what was deemed to be the lowest, the least significant, is actually the highest, as it is the case of plants. When I mention nihilism and the inversion of values, I'm making, as I've already said, what are surely not so veiled references to the philosophy of Nietzsche, who attributed these two phenomena to the entire history of Western metaphysics, commencing with Plato. How do these Nietzschean concepts relate to environmental thinking in general, and the discourses of sustainability in particular? The common root of nihilism and the inversion of values is the prioritization of ideality, of Plato's ideas, of Aristotle's unmoved mover, Augustinian God, Kantian subject, etc., the prioritization of all of that over materiality. Not only is the true ground of existence said to lie elsewhere, in the realm inaccessible to our senses, but also the turn or the return of this ground demands that we forsake materiality and adopt a certain disembodied, indifferent perspective to the world where empirical multiplicities prevail. Such nihilistic indifference to the world, construed as the epiphenomenal expression of a more profound and stable reality, is absolutely detrimental to the environment. So metaphysics is by definition anti-environmental. No matter how much we use and abuse living beings and their ecosystems, metaphysical ideality and truth will suffer no significant alterations. So metaphysics tells us in so many words that even if we destroy the entire livable world, nothing of interest or concern would happen because the true reality is elsewhere. Ideal sustainability, paving the way to the transcendent ground for existence, inevitably undermines material sustainability, which in turn props up and supports, unacknowledged, all metaphysical ventures. The world of Western philosophy is thus constructed in such a way that it systematically distorts and weakens whatever is useful, Nietzsche's words, for life. It bestows the least value on the entities and processes that promote life, and on the other hand, valorizes life-stunting abstractions in their stead. While colloquially, nihilism is associated with a valueless drift, in the aftermath of the destruction of value frameworks, it would be more accurate to diagnose philosophical nihilism as the main effect of the metaphysical values themselves. So nihilism is not the loss of values, it's the exact logical consequence of Western transcendent value systems. The values of pure ideality are incredibly deadly for all aspects of empirical existence that stand in their way. Ideal sustainability is actually self-contradictory in that its ideality militates against the very possibility of sustaining life. And here's the next slide, if we could switch to the screen here. The anti-environmental perspective of metaphysics is unsustainable for at least two reasons. First, it denies its own perspectivalism by claiming exclusive access to the truth. Its disembodied nature and the self-professed indifference to the material world put it in a paradoxical position of a perspective without perspective. Perspective without perspective. A decontextualized and hence independent from the environment, objective description of what is. So when we're talking about the decontextualized truth claim and abstraction, this is the least vegetal way of being and thinking imaginable, because plants thrive and think and are only together with the places where they grow, only within their context. So decontextualization and abstraction are by their nature anti-vegetal. Perspectives necessarily entail a multiplicity of vantage points and modes of accessing existence, something clearly incompatible with metaphysics. Now, secondly, metaphysical anti-environmentalism must obfuscate and repress the fact that it cannot help but rely on materiality and on living beings for its ongoing survival. So this is the old master-slave dialectic. The slave is crucial to the survival of the master, but the master has to obfuscate that necessity of the slave catering to his needs, precisely his needs. Incapable of admitting to this deeper sense of sustainability, it indiscriminately utilizes and often physically obliterates its repressed support. So we're literally cutting the branch on which we're sitting, right? In either case, various types of unsustainability will continue to haunt our thinking and practices so long as we do not call into question the potent remnants of metaphysics that often, without us knowing it, without us realizing it, motivate the discourses that we keep relying on. And in the seminar section of our discussion, we will see that some of these discourses have to do with knowledge production. They have to do with what we deem to be energy or even renewable energy, what renewability actually means, and so on and so forth. This then is the sense in which I would like to begin interpreting Nietzsche's aphorism, the ability to be small, with which we began our discussion. The adulthood that Nietzsche derides there is an allusion to the Kantian ideal of the Enlightenment, our emergence from self-incurred immaturity, which depends in large part on our adoption of inverted metaphysical value systems and predilection to nihilism. Adults have grown up high above the grass and the flowers, though it is not primarily their physical size as compared to that of children that is at stake in this elevation, but a self-aggrandizement on the scale of value and the concomitant diminution of the value of vegetation. What would it mean, in contrast to this ideal, to be, as Nietzsche recommends, as close to the flowers, the grass, and the butterflies as a child? Would it not imply certain sympathy with the earthly perspective of the plants themselves, the sympathy zealous and hyper-adult proponents of the Enlightenment habitually dismiss as mythical, irrational, animist, shamanic, and so on, right? The ability to be small would be the fruit of human self-relativization. So we're not talking here about smallness in quantitative terms, even though diminution of the scales at which our industries operate is also important. We're talking about qualitative smallness, a qualitative diminution, or self-diminution here, right? It is an ontological smallness, not an ontic smallness that Nietzsche has in mind, not the bodily size of human beings who are actually dwarfed by some trees, such as the sequoias, but our proximity to vegetal life, to which we're indebted for the very air we breathe, the food we consume, the medicines that restore us to health, and so on. How are the discourses of sustainability complicit with the object of Nietzschean critique? They are without doubt more adult than the unsustainable metaphysics with its teenage rebelliousness against the very world on which it materially depends. The index for the maturity of sustainable thinking and practices, whether in the natural or in the cultural domains, is the responsibility they are willing to assume for the environment by imposing rational limits on its instrumentalization, not responsibility for ensuring the maintenance of the environment, and even maintenance, or we talked about the problematic terms that are being used and the practices associated with them, the managerial practices, the maintenance practices, but rather this would be a responsibility that would involve a certain self-erasure or self-limitation in terms of the impact that we're having, right? This would be the index for the maturity of sustainable thinking and practices. While against the backdrop of metaphysical excesses, this strategy is laudable, it does not evade criticism inspired by Nietzsche's aphorism. Rather than risk an all-encompassing revaluation of values, what goes on today under the title of sustainability has to do with their fine-tuning that leaves the self-aggrandizing image of humanity intact. Nietzsche would perhaps say that the desire behind the discourses of sustainability, this desire behind the discourses of sustainability is even more condescending than the characteristic of metaphysical philosophy. Our hubris is evident in the belief, still unwilling to let go of the prejudice of ideal sustainability, that we could be the effective and benevolent managers of the planet, which actually sustains us physically and otherwise. The source of the problem, anthropocentrism, endeavors to reform itself so as to spin a possible solution on its own turf. And this is also the case of solutions such as geoengineering, which rely on the same instrumental manipulative logic that brought us to the current situation in order to try to resolve the problems that have emerged as a result. So we have to realize that these problems cannot be solved on the same turf on which they have emerged. That is why the grass hates us when we confess our love for it, in Nietzsche's words, when we're incapable of recognizing its intrinsic value, that is, what it is not only in itself, but also for itself, from its unique vegetal perspective, so dissimilar to and incomprehensible for the fully mature and enlightened humanity that mows it, right? That mows it precisely. Now, to begin shifting, and here's the next slide. To begin shifting the focus from ideal to material sustainability, it will be necessary to admit non-human perspectives, including that of vegetal life, into the midst of environmental discourse and into aesthetic discourses as well, aesthetic practices, treating plants not only as materials with which human artists work, but as co-creators in the artistic practices, as artists in their own right. In what follows, I will point out the most decisive implications of this shift. For now, let me provisionally conclude the analysis of sustainability with the consideration of its suffix, ability, which gives prominence not to what or who actually sustains life, but to what or who could possibly sustain it, sustainability. It focuses on the possibility of sustaining at the expense of actuality, at the expense of who or what actually sustains life. In line with material sustainability, ability would denote the non-transcendental conditions of possibility for the persistence of living beings. Even the most conventional thinking of sustainability is future-oriented, and we all want future-oriented thinking and practices while forgetting the present, while forgetting actuality, while forgetting where we are at this very moment. Right? So there is a future orientation that is driven by a justifiable worry that finite natural resources will at some point be depleted, prejudicing subsequent generations. But the possible is not confined to what may or may not occur in the future. It is also that which enables, makes possible, actively possibilizes the present. So what actually is already a realization of the possible. And we tend to forget it, we tend to overlook it, and to be constantly driven by these empty possibilities that are projected into the future. Right? In keeping with this positive signification, material sustainability lies squarely on the side of plants, both now living and long dead, though still enriching the soil in which they have decayed or transformed into fossil fuels. Where plants already sustain life from below, from the literal and metaphorical ground wherein they're rooted, our chief worry should be with how to sustain sustainability, that is, how to let vegetal beings continue to do what they do best. They're already doing what they do best. And to sustain sustainability, we should just ensure that vegetal beings do what they do best, that is, abstract ourselves and extract ourselves from the equation, in a sense. In other words, our much more modest and oblique role would be to nurture and promote the material conditions of possibility for the possibility of life, rather than investing ourselves directly with the role of the managers or stewards of the environment. Our acknowledgement of vegetal activity would then coincide with a kind of human receptivity, without which theories and practices of sustainability would continue to pose the masked original problem in the guise of a solution. So the need of material sustainability is to become receptive, to become much more receptive. And the sine qua non of environmental receptivity, which should not be conflated with passivity or inaction, would be the interplay of human and non-human perspectives on the environment, an extended non-linguistic dialogue whence a community of sustainable values could be forged. So this is my proposal for possible shapes that material sustainability could take, which would be, as we will see, an interplay of human and non-human perspectives on the environment in a non-linguistic dialogue, giving rise to the ever-shifting communities of sustainable values that are not just abstract values, but that are lived and practiced and performed in actuality. So the next section of my remarks is titled "The Intrinsic Value of Vegetation from the Plant in Itself to the Plant for Itself." Struggles against nihilism, either on the rational or on the affective front, tend to end in deadlock and a sense of futility. As Nietzsche used to argue, humanity must first pass through an intense nihilistic phase, even if it takes hundreds of years, and even if it is questionable whether anything or anyone would remain in its wake, before purging itself of this sentimental attachment to values that turn against life. Right? The point is not to dismiss, but to deepen nihilism for Nietzsche. There is no way of, and this is, by the way, true for anthropocentric perspectives, for everything that we deem undesirable. We cannot simply dismiss these perspectives because, or these modes of thinking, because they are rooted in affect. They are rooted in deep unconscious structures and in hundreds, if not thousands of years of repression that have pushed our engagement with plants to the very bottom of the psychic edifice. So mere dismissal doesn't work. That is why it's necessary to always undertake what I'm calling immanent criticism, what psychoanalysis calls precisely analysis, but extended to the environmental ecological scale, right? So a environmental psychoanalysis in a sense, right? The point is not to dismiss, but to deepen nihilism. Let it resonate in us and shake us with the yawn of nothingness threatening to devour us. And if, while this is not really happening at the intellectual level, it is happening at the level of a deepening environmental crisis. So we're shaken out of complacency by a sense of a catastrophe, impending or already unfolding, right? And this is the unfortunate thing, that instead of doing the preparatory work of letting nihilism itself shake us out of our complacency, it is the actual unfolding ecological catastrophe that has to do this work. To a large extent, this awakening is the effect of the environmental crisis itself, to which sustainability offers something like a response. Sustainability becomes a priority when firm ground shifts under our feet and when it seems that nothing sustains us, right? So we seek sustainability precisely when we feel that nothing sustains us, that we're suspended over an abyss, as it were. For instance, when we lose faith in the meta-narrative of technological progress, or realize that our power to control and dominate our environment threatens to destroy the controlled object altogether, and of course us, ourselves, our species, and many other species as well. When we learn about the accelerating disappearance of plant varieties, with more than 1/5 of the flora worldwide slated for extinction in the not so distant future, and yet discourses of sustainability cannot afford to undertake the revaluation of human relation to the environment within the same productivist, progressivist paradigm that has been responsible for the dire situation of the planet today. Embedding sustainable development in the context of instrumental rationality is analogous to using more economical construction materials and more efficient architectural designs for a house built on the slopes of an active volcano, right? So we can always improve and make house design more ecologically friendly and more efficient, but if it's built on the slope of an active volcano, none of this will do. An obvious alternative to this is to insist on the intrinsic value of ecosystems and their members, as theorists associated with the deep movement still from the second half, the middle to the second half of the last century. It has been largely forgotten, but has a lot to offer actually to the discussion today. It would appear that in the notion of intrinsic and whether or not it may be Kant, intrinsic value is the end in itself, which refers to the ethical status of human beings who should not be used as means for externally imposed ends in Kantian philosophy, right? Kant is not only highly anthropocentric in his moral philosophy, but also logocentric, since this ethical status is applicable in general to any rational being, but in particular to humans alone, insofar as they are the subjects of reason. And by the way, to humans not as members of a certain species, but to humans precisely as subject to reason. So all kinds of so-called irrational humans would be even excluded from this category. There is for Kant nothing respect-worthy in our animal, empirical, flesh and blood constitution. The body in and for itself does not deserve ethical protection as an end in itself. Needless to say, according to this philosophical system, neither animals nor plants nor the environment as a whole would be covered by the precepts of intrinsic value simply because they do not participate in the community of rational beings who are ideally autonomous and whose individual actions are strictly in keeping with the ethical universality of pure practical reason that prompts them to will exactly the same in any given case. The extension of intrinsic value to other than human beings will without a doubt interfere with the Kantian sense of the end in itself, from which it will nonetheless retain the absolute resistance to the logic of means and ends, thus to the possibility of instrumentalization. So the idea is not to give up the Kantian notion of the end in itself, but to extend it to all living beings. and to ecosystems. And it will also capitalize on the most radical conclusions of Kant's philosophy of finitude, marked by an insistence on the self-limitation or self-critique of human reason. So human reason is not something to be revered and admired and worshipped, but in fact should be subject to merciless self-limitation and self-critique, according to Kant himself. If plants, for instance, possess intrinsic value, it is because not everything in their mode of being turns its face toward us. Despite the indisputable advances in plant sciences that study these marvelous capacities of plants. So the plant is not only for us, but and not only in itself, but also for itself. As a non-object of knowledge and manipulation, the plant is, again in Kantian jargon, a thing in itself, which does not mean that it is simply mysterious, but that it also exists and is of value for itself. After Kant, Hegel dialectically transformed the thing in itself into the thing for itself, and hence into the subject, who never finds anything but itself behind the curtain of phenomenal appearances. The same can be said of the plant endowed with intrinsic value that prompts its metamorphosis from the plant in itself into the plant for itself, a living being with a uniquely vegetal perspective on the world. Right? With this, the plant exceeds everything measured and measurable from the human standpoint and appears to be incommensurable to us, even though its thriving is not at all contrary to our own. Here's the next slide. Here we will turn to Nietzsche again on vegetal perspectivalism. So perspectives then are a feature of all subjects, not only human subjects, and plants as living subjects in their own right have their own perspectives on the world. Nietzsche's thinking was exquisitely attuned to the perspective of the plants themselves. He was not just kind of dismissed as a relativist who relativized all human perspectives, but in fact was exquisitely attuned to the perspective of the plants themselves, inassimilable to the human view of the world. When Nietzsche writes in one of his early notebooks that, and I quote here, you have the quote on the screen, "To the plant, the whole world is plant, to us, man." Or when in The Will to Power, he explains Schopenhauer's epistemological pessimism with which he largely identifies in terms of the understanding that there is no absolute nature of things and that reality is given through necessarily perspectival appearances. When he does all of that, Nietzsche hints at what is behind the idea of the plant for itself. Above all, it leads us to believe that there is not one true world, but multiple worlds of humans, animals, plants, and so forth that only imperfectly overlap in the interactions of their inhabitants. So we're not here talking about multi-species perspectives, but multi-world perspectives. It is not that multiple species inhabit the same world, offering different perspectives on this world, but in fact, in these different species and biological kingdoms, there are multiple worlds that partially overlap as well, right? Thanks to our faculty of imagination and our mimetic plasticity, the uncanny capacity to put ourselves in the shoes and sometimes the skins and the roots of others, it is possible to displace, if only for a short while, the habitual anthropocentric perspective that passes for the objective view of the world. As Nietzsche notes, again here in the quote you have on the screen, if we could only perceive now as a bird, now as a worm, now as a plant, then nobody would talk about such a regularity of nature, but would understand it only a highly subjective construct, unquote. The intrinsic value of each kind of being is the perspective through which it relates to and indeed constructs its world. And this perspective is inseparable from the living extension, from the living body of that very being. So perspectives are not intellectual, pure constructs or projections. They are inseparable from the embodied orientations and movements of these living beings. It is in this multiplicity of biological species and kingdom-specific approaches to what is, it is this multiplicity that should capture the attention of those interested in sustainability. The possibility of approximation between environmental theory and Nietzschean perspectivalism hinges upon the materiality at the core of both approaches. In the history of philosophy, at least since Descartes, a multiplicity of perspectives was thought to be the feature of the human view of spatially extended things. So Western philosophers have thought about multiple perspectives as limited to a spatial view onto the world, right? It is not what we think and rationally construct, but only those perspectives that relate to space. Hegel maintained that perception dealt with the ever-changing manifold, empirically rich, but empty and abstract from the standpoint of ideal spirit. And Edmund Husserl, in his phenomenology, conceived of everything that transcends or lies outside our consciousness as given through adumbrations, the essentially incomplete and infinitely multiple surfaces that reveal certain sides of things at the price of occluding their other dimensions. So we get cubism, for instance, as an expression of that in art. Now, material sustainability, and here you have another slide. Material sustainability, we may conclude, involves a multiplicity of species-related perspectives as a necessary feature of its materiality. The more materially grounded an approach to the world is, the more perspectives it will welcome into its midst without narrowing the environment down to objective reality. And so we know that the depletion of species, the depletion of languages, of diversities of all kinds, is not just the elimination of these modes of expression or of these kinds of living beings, it's the elimination of perspectives on the world that are equivalent to the world itself, right? The more we impoverish this richness of perspectives, the more we undermine the very materiality of the world and shape it after the ideal image of what reality is. Material sustainability sustains at bottom this very multiplicity, according the highest value to the propagation of diverse worlds. To sustain sustainability is to enable the untamed self-proliferation of multiplicities outside and beyond any ideal forms, any imposed forms, including the form of diversity that we may want to subject beings to, right? And the garden as a certain ideal form is definitely one important construct here. So there is a need to deformalize the garden in this sense. I think this is what we were exploring also today in this morning's discussion. All this requires, in the first instance, not so much a change in practice, but a change in attitude, in systems of valuation, and in the place we assign to ourselves vis-a-vis other beings, whether living or not. So the change of practice, of course, is necessary, but it needs to at least go hand in hand with a change in attitude that in which it would be grounded. Here's another slide. So the question is, but why plants? Why situate plants at the forefront of perspectival environmentalism and material sustainability? Because aside from the already mentioned support they provide to the living, their perspective is much more material than that of humans and other animals, which is to say also much more diverse. They live without resorting to the ideal powers of representation and without distancing themselves from the world in the manner of animal sensorium. Already Nietzsche recognized this feature of plant thinking in the exemplary non-imagistic, non-conscious, and non-conscious in the sense of representative or representational consciousness, and wholly material memory of the mimosa plant, Mimosa pudica, or the sensitive plant that closes its leaves when you touch it. Such proximity to materiality translates into vegetal hospitality to the multiplicity of other perspectives and modes of being, from which the plant does not ward itself off. Free of any individuated, clearly demarcated self, its being in and for itself is at the same time its being for and the sustaining of the other. Right? So being for the other is inseparable from being in and for itself in the case of a plant. That is why even the very distinction between instrumentality and values in itself collapses and makes no sense on the grounds of vegetality itself. right? Like the material substratum of life to which it stays close, the plant subtends other forms of existence, even if this underlying gets mistaken for its low position on the scale of being and value. And then you have another very short quote from Nietzsche here. Do plants exist in order to be eaten by animals? There is no purpose. We deceive ourselves, right? So this attribution of cause-effect relations, of instrumental reasoning as opposed to values in themselves, all of this is dismissed, and this mode of thinking itself becomes unsustainable. So to conclude very briefly, a third portion of my remarks on sustainable perspectivalism and the community of values. You have the slide here. Now, when debating the values of sustainability, one should not shy away from what in Aristotelian parlance is known as its final causes, that is, that for the sake of which it may be valuable. The obvious answer to the Aristotelian question, tinged with a dose of anthropocentrism, is that the main beneficiaries of sustainability are human beings, both those presently living and the future generations. But if we take seriously Nietzsche's claim that all valuation proceeds from a definite perspective, we would have to admit the incompletely conscious or the entirely non-conscious perspective of other than human beings into environmental practices aspiring to justice, and as we mentioned today, perhaps into artistic or aesthetic practices as well, right? It is non-anthropocentric perspectivalism alone that would be truly sustainable, as it would ensure the proliferation of non-human worlds, neither as objects valuable for us, nor even as things valuable in themselves, but as values for themselves from their unique perspectives. Right, and there is a very wonderful strand of perspectivalism that is also discussed by Viveiros de Castro in the South American context, of course, that resonates with much of what I'm saying here within an imminent critique of Western metaphysics. Now, the propagation of disjointed multiplicities, not bound into a single whole, is precisely the principle of vegetal life. Nietzsche's to the plant, a whole world as a plant, means that to the plant, the world is a growing being, right? If a plant is a growing being, then to a plant, the whole world is a plant, the whole world is a growing being, right? In and of itself, a plant is already a community of beings. In the words of Francis Halley, an equivalent to an animal population or a meta-population. So each plant in its singularity is already a population, a multiplicity. Right? A meta-population. It spans distinct spatial perspectives, seeking water and minerals from the darkness of the soil and carbon dioxide, along with solar energy from the open expanses above it. The plant in its singularity is thus a microcosm of multiple perspectives coexisting in the meta-population that comprises every single plant. Thanks to its specific world creation, it sustains and exposes itself to a vast array of worlds without reducing them to elements of the same, right? Now, next slide here. An important forerunner to sustainable perspectivalism is Aldo Leopold's Ethics of the Land. As Leopold puts in a Sand County Almanac in the North American context, and I quote, land ethics simply enlarged the boundaries of the community to include soils, waters, plants, and animals, or collectively the land, right? So this is what community means. This is what land ethic means. Community includes soils, waters, plants, animals, right? These are not just the basis or the foundation for community. They are community. Citizenship in this community precludes human stewardship of the environment and affirms the right to continued existence of all its members, irreducible to natural resources or to nothing but natural resources. Despite a difference in perspectives, the common material, not ideal value underpinning land ethic is one of existence, which is less homogeneous than that of life, understood objectively as dispersed into different modes, human, animal, plant. Now, in a more recent version of Leopold's land ethic, we can see that version in the French context, for instance, in the writings of the late Michel Serres, who proposes the creation of a world parliament, where air and water, energy and soil, as well as the living species would be represented, right? So community, including political community, would include all of these different perspectives of what it means to be a world, to be in the world. This parliament of mutes, as Serre calls it, would be the political expression of land ethic, where the non-conscious intentionalities, non-sentient interests, and the sheer existence of members would be promoted along with the multiplicity of perspectives that they are and that they embody. But the challenge is to imagine a transition from this dispersed multiplicity to a community of human and non-human beings, right? If the life of plants holds the key to this non-totalizing binding of water, solar energy, and the soil in which they grow, and which they enrich by decaying into it, with the living species that depend on them as nourishment, respiration, reproduction, or shelter. This is because plants grow in between and form living channels between the organic and the inorganic realms. So instead of imposing these parliamentary arrangements onto an enlarged notion of the community, it might be better to start with plants, because plants build these communities around themselves. They grow and thrive in and as these communities that are always more than vegetal, right? And that is why in one of the slides, we saw that if for a plant, the whole world is a plant, then in ancient Greek philosophy, the approximation to that was calling nature itself physis. Physis is a living, growing being, right? So what in our Latinized version we call nature, natura, for the Greeks was the overall growth of everything, the entire world understood as a plant or as a vegetal community, right? So this is not a totalizing creation of a community, but precisely a living, dynamic organization from the in-between that is already vegetal. Not only do plants create microclimates propitious to the life of animals, but they also sustain the conjunction of all these elements without including them in an all-encompassing immanent milieu, be it place or land. In their singularity, plants stand for the place of their growth, not canceling out, but on the contrary, interrelating the multiplicity of other perspectives by putting them into a mute dialogue and enhancing what I have termed in these remarks material sustainability. So in conclusion, here's the last final slide, the emergent community of values reflecting the distinct perspectives of its participants is perhaps not altogether different from the biontological community that is the plant, conceived as a metapopulation. So in other words, we should try to conceive once again the world as a plant. Even though it is to a plant that the whole world is a plant, we should make an effort and say that to a human, the whole world is a plant too. Plural in its very singularity. The plant also gathers around itself like a green magnet, the organic and the inorganic, the living and the dead, soil and air, minerals and animals. All of the blurry lines between realms that are usually kept separate in our systems of classification that have given so much headache to Western philosophers. These are the areas of promise. These are the areas that we should be plugging ourselves into and growing in and with. Discourses of sustainability would benefit greatly from learning this expanded version of value pluralism from the very beings whose continued existence they wish to sustain. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Is this working?
Yeah.
Okay. Just to check out if our participants on Zoom can hear me. Do you hear me? 1, 2, 3, 4. Amazing. Okay, thank you, Michael, so much for this fantastic lecture. It was very, I made a lot of notes, many of us. So now we have time for questions. And
if not, I have a question to start. If you want to warm up.
Sure.
So one question would be, I'm not familiar with the concept of Serre's world parliament, but
what would you say, how could we overcome the problem of representation in this concept when speaking about implementing the values of pluralism of plant or the vegetal or the living, and when trying to act it out, to put it into practice in something that is called the world parliament of the vegetal or of the living? Because,
yes, I absolutely share your criticism of this term, because it still operates on the anthropocentric grounds of language and representation being completely symbolic and verbal, right? So, of course, Serre still wants to articulate a certain muteness of the elements of plants with a voice that would be given to them, but by human representatives in this world parliament. You could say that at the very most embodied level, the very growth of plants, the way they articulate themselves, the way they place their branches or their parts, their leaves, is a kind of language. It's a spatial expression of that plant in that particular space or that particular place in that time. So this is just one example of what communication and language would look like outside of this problem of reducing everything to symbolic representation and expression. So I listed Serre's proposal because it has been influential, but I share your unease with it. And I would rather go through the route of thinking about the world, the community, and languages, starting from the plants themselves, that do not necessarily involve vocalization and expression through the vocal medium.
I just wanted to mention that there is this artistic project by Club Real. I don't know if you know it. It's called Democracy of Organisms. And they do it very often in like post-industrial sites where they analyze all the organisms that live there. And then they encourage local community to start representing different categories of organisms. And then they come together in the parliament. But I guess I saw some recordings, and I think the parliament, there is a lot of language involved, but maybe if they expand it into more artistic forms of expression in these meetings of the parliament, maybe that would be better to go beyond this language. But the procedure is that humans kind of start to get more and more involved with these organisms, understand them better, and then there is, for example, like a public event, and you can visit these sites and listen to audio pieces where humans are kind of impersonating organisms, you know. So there are like inherent tensions to that, but there's also an attempt to make the organism to be heard, but it's human language.
Yes, and that's why I try to coin this term ideal sustainability as a handy concept, precisely to analyze these experiments, because when human beings still present themselves or put themselves in the role of mouthpieces for other than human beings, then we're walking the line of ideal sustainability and not material sustainability. This to me sounds like a piece of hubris once again, because plants have perfected over millions of years precisely their role as intermediaries, as mediators between the different realms, what is below and what is above, between the elements, among various living beings. And so to say that with our limited parliamentary procedures, we could interpose these procedures in the place of vegetal mediations, this to my mind would be another case of ideal sustainability.
But we have to defend them from other humans, so we have to communicate with other humans about it as well.
Yes.
Other questions? We have some questions in the Zoom. Maybe we can do like one from the room, one from the Zoom. Could you expand on the need to deformalize the garden? Like maybe once more explain what you meant with that.
Yes. So, of course, this was related to the experience we had this morning and really a wonderful walk and explanation. But The idea is that a garden, as it emerges in various cultures, not only in Europe, but also in Asia, in many parts of the world, the garden is understood as a form that is imposed on living beings. So it formalizes a certain piece of the environment, always including some beings and excluding others. And so a deformalization of the garden would involve a kind of a radical shift in the very concept of the garden. The garden would no longer be a form, or at least it would not be a form separated from the matter, living matter that is included under its protection, but rather it would be the form that co-evolves and emerges from the living themselves. In this case, plants, but also microorganisms living in the soil, the birds and other animal visitors and humans who come into the garden. All of these interactions, all of these material processes would invent and reinvent each time anew the form of the garden, right? So this is what I meant by a deformalization, right? Removing this empty form that is a priori imposed onto the environment and then coded as a garden, with all the practical consequences of keeping certain beings in and keeping other beings out. And allowing for what in ancient Greek thought is called hylomorphism, that is the co-evolution, the radical belonging together of matter and form, hylomorphism. Hyle is the Greek for matter and morphe is form. So hylomorphism is the co-belonging and co-development of matter and form, not an external imposition of form onto matter.
But it doesn't mean that we do nothing. It means like a collaboration.
It is a collaboration. It is an interaction. In fact, we probably do much more and many more varied activities than the formal gardening bent on simply keeping the unwanted intruders out and caring for those wanted beings inside. So it would enlarge the very scope of interactions within the situation of the garden.
Okay, so great talk. Thank you so much. I guess I was thinking on the fact that plants have a language too. They express, but there are also ways of reading plants' languages. Maybe goes back also to these various practices that are, what we from here would say secular or at the peripheries of our thinking. So my question goes, and I'm still trying to articulate this question, but what is there to say in relationship to these capacities to suddenly read the languages? Maybe this nihilism that you described, staying close to the flower, staying like refuting directionality, for example, of removing by all means possible ourselves from the soil, from the ground, to the extent of building flying machines that takes us up into the sky. So in that sense, to go back to these capacities that might be still here, what can awaken them to read the ethnograms expressed in how seeds sort of fall to the ground, how maybe a leaf might be shaped by the wind, and how they plants in themselves express this environment. So what is there to awaken that other language?
Yes, so obviously plants don't only have a language, they have languages, multiple languages at their disposal. And if you approach it from the standpoint of plant sciences, then you could say that the biochemical substances that they release both through their roots and above ground are a kind of language, a language of biochemistry to communicate to other plants, to communicate to insects and other animals, sometimes to communicate to themselves. So a distant part of a plant will release a certain cue to another part of a distant part of itself to, for instance, alert about the presence of a herbivore insect, right? So it's a kind of self-communication system that in the situational fragmentary way constructs the self-consciousness, the self-reflexivity of a plant, its relation to itself, right? But this, even though this is really fascinating, it still reduces language to a system of communication, right? And language is much more than that. Obviously, language has a communicative aspect. It has an aspect of representation in human cases, right? Or in the case of human language. But language at the broadest level is a way of articulating. Language is articulation. Right. And I've always liked this word articulation because it's a performative word. It does precisely what it says, which is it articulates two different senses. It puts them together. One is the sense of verbal expression. So by speaking, I'm articulating my thoughts. And a person who is well-spoken is said to be articulate, at least in English, right? But articulation is also spatial. It is not just the spiritual exercise. It's also putting things together in space. By the door is articulated by a hinge with a wall, right? That's articulation also. So in these two senses of articulation, we already surpassed the Cartesian divide between the mind and the body, between the extended and the non-extended substance. Articulation applies to both. And language as articulation is this embodied and at the same time spiritual, you could say, endeavor that passes from one side to another. It might be more articulation in one sense or more articulation in the other sense. And plants excel at this. They are the great articulators. And by the way, earlier when I suggested that plants can be considered as artists, one of the arguments for that is precisely that art, as at least its Latinized Latin word is saying, is a practice of articulation. At its most basic level, not only language, but art is an articulation. And plants are the great articulators, are the great artists of existence, of themselves. In the first place, they articulate themselves and constantly re-articulate themselves because their bodily positions are constantly shifting, their body parts are shifting, they will grow more parts, they will lose other parts, right? It's a constant self-reinvention, but really in the precise sense of a self-re-articulation, right? It is in that, in this sense that I'm saying that the body language of a plant is precisely a language, right? A way of expressing itself in space and re-expressing continuously.
There is a very interesting artwork. It's a movie by Åsa Sonia's daughter that I think unfortunately will not join us. And in the movie, she's interviewing a man who is taking care of a seed bank in Sweden. And he's basically constantly planting the plants from the seed bank and then selecting. And he's quite scientific person, but there's a moment in this movie when he said that I'm communicating with plants, and he then explains that it's through careful observation, the colors, the shapes. But there is this kind of one moment where
I'm communicating every day with the tomatoes. I remove the suckers, which puts energy into the uprising and concentrates them in the fruit. So there's this constant in between. The plant tells me what to do. It guides me. It's not the other way around. I work with plants. They always tell me what to do. It's I never have an idea. I see, and then sometimes I fuck something up, and then it will tell me that I did it wrong. That this is not the way to go. And it's a different perspective. I think it's about intention in that sense.
Maybe keep it closely to your mouth. I think it works better because we had some complaints from participants on Zoom that they don't hear us so well.
Okay. I hope they can hear me now. Thank you, Marder, for the intervention. I want actually to build up upon Yuri's comment and wonder how we can include actually these non-human voices in our structures and institutions of knowledge. So we have non-Western epistemologies that are telling us that actually non-humans have voices, they have cosmologies, but we have also in Western philosophy, I'm sure you're acquainted with new materialism, right, which is telling us about the ethical onto-epistemologies, right? But still, I think field philosophy, experimental ethnography, so all these sort of yeah, like systems of knowledge that are trying to embed within themselves this theory are still quite marginal in the overall construction of knowledge. And especially like thinking about the transposition or the movement from ideal sustainability towards material sustainability is probably like very important also to involve the sciences, right? So the biology. And it's very interesting. I was reading an article about by Kirksey about experimental and multi-species ethnography. And he was like describing the debate, the internal debate and contradiction in biologists and botanists, because they do experience the voice of plants, but they can't, because of their background and their education in these sciences, they can't accept it. So they're living this sort of contradiction within themselves.
Yes, and it's not only a contradiction, I would say, I completely agree with you, but it goes even beyond that, because plant scientists who actually are developing the field of plant intelligence, they do want to recognize the specific subjectivity of plants, the specific capacities of plants as subjects, but very often they do not have the philosophical tools at their disposal to do so. And that's where collaborative projects become extremely important, because none of us can accomplish this from our own limited perspective. So these collaborative projects are not only kind of an institutional ideal, but something that we can learn from the plants themselves. There is no way to approach them more or less ethically, more or less with a sense of justice, without cross-disciplinary collaboration. So I have been collaborating with plant scientists, among other people, for almost 15 years now. But it is true that this group of plant scientists is relatively small. They're very embattled within their field. They're constantly, they're periodic, every 5 years, there is a big critique in the annals of botany saying these people are completely crazy, even though their experimental design is fine. They don't know what they're talking about when they talk about plant learning or plant decision making or plant intelligence, generally speaking. There is a lot of work to be done even within the disciplinary confines of plant science. But I think that this emerging split among plant scientists is actually an encouraging sign. It's a sign that the discipline is not stagnant. It's moving at its radical edges, represented by these plant scientists who are developing plant intelligence studies. And there's maybe hope for the rest of the discipline if that spreads from the margins to the center as well.
And there are also these scientists that are really also artists, yeah? Like, for example, Robin Wall-Kimmerer, her writing, it's super poetic, so they acknowledge, I think, this, and they are not the ones that repress it, but, or I really love, there is this poet, Urszula Zajączkowska, who is a botanist and really doing experiments with plants, and she's an amazing poet. So I think that it's also like some kind of an emerging group of the scientists that feel that the language of science is not the only perspective they have, basically. And I reminded myself there's a very interesting sci-fi novel, Semiosis, do you know it? No. Of Sue Berg. It's basically about sentient plants, and the plot is that humans destroyed Earth, so they had to emigrate to another planet. And on this planet, plants evolved for a much longer time than on Earth. And they realized that there is some kind of a, possibility of communication. And then at the end, there's like, I think, a rainbow bamboo plant. I think that's the name of this, that they becomes like member of their community and mediates between them and other beings. And they have a kind of they have really a communication. But I'm not sure, after our discussion, if the thinking in this book goes in the right direction, but at least there is this consciousness in this book that the plants are, much more than we tend to think, and that there is this potentiality there, but maybe it's not even a potentiality to be sentient, but they already are sentient, I would say. But it's a very good book, I think. Do we have any other questions?
Yes.
Are we running out? Oh yeah, we're only. Okay.
Yeah, just maybe to come back to this, discover the plants within us, because it's interesting, because I think still there is the need to be more articulate in this re-articulation with plants, or in this, I don't know, interaction or reconnection to this world. But maybe it's also a question of, first of all, re-articulate us, because in the end we are also plants. No, there is not this separation. We are also part of it. We are plants, but through Western metaphysics, maybe we were pushed out or disconnected, and we've forgotten, like, or a lot of people have forgotten. So what would be a way, because you said we have to discover the plant within us, maybe through digestion, whatever, but how? I mean, I'm really asking for a practical exercise that we maybe could also perform. I don't know, like trying out. How do you do it to think about it?
Yes, so it has to do with the kind of ontological features of vegetal life that often we do not realize that we share with plants. For instance, at the level of breathing, we think that our breathing organ is the lung, it's the interior one, but we also breathe on our skin, right? Just as leaves breathe on their skin. So the importance of the surface that has been absolutely repressed throughout centuries of Western metaphysics is a rediscovery of the plant within us, of a certain, what I call essential superficiality, both at the level of the body, at the level of thought gliding at the surface of things, and not trying to extract everything from their depth. This is what we will be talking about next in our seminar as well. Taking these features, both structural features, but also ontological features of vegetal life, and seeing how they apply to the human physical constitution, psychic constitution, and even collective. Remember, plants are metapopulations. In every single plant is a metapopulation already, right? At the level of our political practices and social practices, in what ways does our political world become more vegetal, right? Because again, to return to Germany from the 19th century, Hegel imagined the state as a total organism, as an animal organism, where every single part is dependent on the whole, and there is a kind of necessary arrangement among all the totalizing parts. In the case of plants, it doesn't work this way, because plants have parts that they can easily lose without perishing necessarily, unlike an organism, an animal organism, and they can grow new parts, often unexpectedly. And this, it's more and more the case that our societies and our political structures and even our communication networks are becoming much more vegetal than we realize. So as always, where I think Hegel was right is by the time we recognize the development, it's been there in place for a long time. So I would say the world is already vegetal, the outside world, but also our political and social world is already vegetal. Our thinking has not yet caught up with that. Yeah.
Sounds like a perfect conclusion, the ending sentence. Thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you.
Thank you. I also thank all the participants on Zoom for being with us. And yeah, we continue with the seminar. This part will not be on Zoom, unfortunately. And I think we will meet at 4, and we will do it in the garden, where we have the wooden banks, you know. You can meet there at 4 p.m.
Let's do some outdoor.